Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. And what I would like to do with you in this last presentation before lunch is to discuss with you the lessons learned from pediatric medicines. The foremost speakers in this presentation, in this session, have already talked much about product quality and geriatric medicines. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, I would like to explain that the product quality involves more than the formulation. Indeed, it also includes the packaging, and it also includes the user instruction, and to be specific, Section 6 of the SPC and the patient information leaflet. And all that together is the quality of the product, which is merely described in the CTD Module 3. But by going through this presentation, I would like to go back with you to the basics. And let's see if we can combine everything the speakers have already been discussed. And for that, I think we need to go to the title as a first, because it talks about lessons from pediatric medicines. But what are pediatric medicines done in fact? And we had lengthy discussions over pediatric medicines before we decided that it's the medicines that is used in children within a specific age limit, 0 to 18 years. And we also had lengthy discussions to realize that, of course, a baby is quite different from a school kid and quite different from an adolescent, and that for clinical reasons, we have to divide this group into further subgroups, and we did so in ICH. And we had also merely discussions that from a pharmaceutical technology aspect, the design of a medicine should be tailored to the child's age, and that necessitates different formulations for different age group, and that it would probably be very difficult to come up with one formulation, one medicinal product that would fit all. So it seems that we have agreement on the major fundamentals, but still when we talk about practical things, it's not that easy. If you're working for industry or if you are an assessor and you come up with a plan or a scientific study, then you have to make decisions. If, for example, you do a study and it's shown that within that group of selected patients, 90% of the children will be able to follow the instruction and take a tablet as a whole and not chew on it because it's a prolonged release tablet, would that be sufficient to come up with that formulation in that age group? Or would it be insufficient because 10% of the children would fail to meet the user instruction? And the same may be applied to the swallowing of mini tablets. Recently, a study has been published by Spomer and Riet-Nales showing that for children below the age, from the age of 6 months, all of them were able to swallow 2 millimeter mini tablets. And that's a very easy finding because it gives you a clear conclusion. But when we did not have that study, and the only available study was there from Thompson, we had a much more difficult result to interpret, because they found that 46% within the age group of 2 years, were able to swallow a 3 millimeter tablet. And would that make a 3 millimeter tablet acceptable for that age group or not? So one of the lessons I would learn from the pediatrics is to show you that it's very clear to have a good definition from the geriatric population, that you really need to discuss about further classification and the subgroups, and not only from a clinical perspective, but also from a quality perspective. And if you're talking about the results and the studies that have to be performed, that you also have got any idea about the target result you would find acceptable. That's talking about pediatric medicines from a pediatric and age perspective. But there is also other ways you can discuss pediatric medicines. For example, according to their method of manufacturing. We've got medicines that are manufactured by a pharmacy, and they can do that on the basis of the raw active substance, but they can also take a licensed product as a start. For example, they dilute a licensed liquid, or they take a tablet and they crush it and then put it into capsules. And it's not always difficult, it's not always easy for a patient or a healthcare pharmacist to make the differentiation. Because what, for example, would a product be when you break a tablet, but breaking at the same time is not allowed in the SPC? And also talking about licensed product, it may not be that easy because a licensed product can be used within the label or outside the label, But when it's outside the label, you still have to consider whether it's there because of the age group, the indication, or the dosing regimen. And also when you talk it within that label, it means that you really have to have a clear SPC saying that this formulation is for this specific age group and for that dosing strength. But this is in fact not the case when you go back to the SPC which are currently available for all the patients on the market, just because some of them have been approved 10 or 20 years ago. And in fact, we did a study in the Netherlands to look at the availability of licensed pediatric medicines, and we came back to the conclusion that we needed to set a full set of criteria only in order to be able to see, is this a pediatric medicine on basis of the SPC or not? And next slide before I touch something out of control. So the second lesson I would like to teach from the pediatrics, that of course the same categorization applies to geriatric medicines, licensed, unlicensed, pharmacy compounded. But if we talk in this kind of sessions and I hear all the problems, are we then talking about the same medicines? Is there people who talk about geriatric medicines as a whole, pharmacy compounded, off-label and within label? And maybe there is others who only talk about the licensed one, and it's very important to realize what you're talking about. It also, in my opinion, shows that the need we have for definitions and taxonomy in pediatrics is also valid for geriatrics. And maybe I can give you an advice that from the start you realize which terms you would like to discuss, who is involved, who takes the lead, and that you have good liaison with other parties and not come up with different definitions at about the same time. Next slide, please. So exploring the title a bit further, it was lessons learned, but we should also realize lessons learned by whom? Is it the lessons learned by industry when developing pediatric formulations, either as part of a pediatric investigation plan, which has to be then assessed by the PDCO, or for a new generic product, or was it for a variation? Or was it the experience gained by the regulators, either the PDCO or the CHMP, or the national assessors in the member states, and was it then experience in relation to the assessment of products where there was a PIP and which was quite recently developed, or was it the experience in relation to the older PIPs? And of course, we also got the experience from the academia and the patients. Next slide, please. So the other lesson we can learn from this is that we really should assure that all parties work closely together from the beginning, that we transfer information from the beginning, and that is very key, and that websites are an easy method to do so. That it's very important, if you have all those groups, that you know each other a bit, that you understand your background, that you explore them, and that you realize that some simple things in the legislation, like better medicines, better health, and not hindering trade, can cause tremendous problems when you are discussing within expert how to, for example, deal with preservatives in pediatric medicines. And that you think from the patient, I mean, we would like to assure good regulatory practice, and we discuss as regulators from procedures and from new and existing medicines. But in the end, the patient is just going to the pharmacy and he doesn't care about the day the product was licensed. And from some quality aspects, it just assumes that they will be the same. And of course, if you realize that background is essential, all of us need some bit of training. A scientist needs to know something about regulatory affairs and the health in the hospitals and all the other way around. Next slide, please. So what have we done then so far? And I would like to share with you that the first document we did for the pediatrics was a reflection paper. It was, I think, of tremendous value, but what was often forgotten is that the reflection paper is what it is, no more and no less. The reflection paper is to communicate the current status, to invite comment, and to provide a framework for discussion. But a reflection paper is not there to provide scientific, technical, or regulatory guidance. And as such, it's very difficult in marketing authorization applications or PIP assessments to ask for compliance to it. So of course, next slide, somewhere in time, a guideline had to be developed, because a guideline is what a reflection paper is not. It has a legal basis. It provides advice to applicants and marketing authorization holders and interested parties, and it goes about scientific issues and tries to achieve harmonization. Next slide. But of course, the good and a very difficult question in that process is when do you come up with a reflection paper? When do you come up with a guideline? And how you balance timing? If you come up with them too late, you know, there is a lot of jurisprudence set, and it is not of much value anymore. But if you come up with it too early, you are missing the scientific basis and you have the real knowledge gap. So it's thinking about what are the anticipated achievements, what is the correct moment in time. And in fact, for the pediatrics, we did something in between. We developed a reflection paper first, came up with a concept paper for a guideline, but at the same time we drafted a concept paper. We already put in some valuable guidance, and now in the end we have a draft guideline which we hope to finalize in the near future. Next slide. Talking about that guideline, what I would like to share with you is a tip of what is in it. It's the aspects that we feel we're making a pediatric medicine age appropriate. There's several of them. They follow the route of development from the medicines and go from the active substance, the route of administration and dosage form, through matters like dosing frequency, modified release preparations, the choice of the excipients, patient acceptability and taste, to the packaging and the user information. Next slide. But of course, although it quite looks a simple list, it was not that a simple exercise. And if we're talking about geriatric medicines and what would making a medicine geriatric as such, we need to go through that list as well, but recall ourselves whether it is the same list. And I would say no, it will be a different list, but how will the list look like? There should be consensus and agreement on the aspects to be considered for the quality of geriatric medicines. And then as the final result, it may show up that you don't need a special medicine. Maybe it's the same as an adult one or a pediatric one, but you should have that picture in your mind. You should know which aspects are then identical to pediatrics and geriatrics. When it comes to splitting devices, I would say it won't matter much whether it's handled by a child or a geriatric patient, and in the end you want to have the same requirements. And of course you need to know very clear when you come up with a reflection paper or a guideline what knowledge is available and what is still missing. And this is one of the aspects I did together with the Medicines Evaluation Board as a preparation for the pediatric guideline. Next slide. Also, the principles of the guideline were maybe easy if you read them now, but a lot of discussion from the start. Because if you're going to write a guideline on the pharmaceutical development of pediatric medicines and would include everything that is relevant to it, you probably would end up with a 100 pages document. Because a lot of the things that are very important for the development of a human medicines are also for a pediatric one. And we decided only to put in the information that was specific to the pediatrics and not the same. That means that everybody who is going to develop a pediatric medicine should have good knowledge of all the requirements for human medicines. That's all the guidelines which are on the EMA network. That's a lot, and you need to know the European Pharmacopoeia on top. The structure, as I've explained, followed the development process, but maybe for geriatrics you need to select quite something different. We covered all aspects of Module 3, and on top of that we realized that the excipients in the formulation from a pediatric perspective are very important because there is a safety aspects included as well. And what we developed together with the safety working party was a decision tree to allow the stakeholders to demonstrate that an excipient was safe for use. Next slide. So in conclusion, talking about everything said today, it is a lot about the formulation and the packaging and the user instruction, but we should never forget that there is a world besides it. Not all problems that are related to the use of a medicine can be solved through regulatory incentives on the formulation. As already been touched by others, if a specific formulation is not fully reimbursed and patients do not get it, you have another type of a problem, and you cannot solve that through here. If the patient has his own opinion, is not taking the medicine, with pediatrics we have the saying in the Netherlands, ik ben 2 en ik zeg nee, so I'm 2 and I say no. It says something about the character. Maybe elderly patients have a specific character as well. So should we better focus on behavioral aspects as well? And if we're talking about specific characteristics, are they really specific for the elderly, like limited hand force, or might it be more comparable to some specific situations for adults and children as well, and not really relate to age? So in conclusion, last slide, I would say the lessons learned is that we realize that pediatric and geriatric development formulation issues are not the same. They may be the same, but not in principle the same. And that for that reason, although we got specific requests, the pediatric guideline will remain what it is and will not be combined into a pediatric and geriatric guideline. It's also important that appropriate geriatric medicine development is a shared responsibility, that everybody does, work on the same final goal from the start. This is what we're here today. And from that, I think we can also maybe learn a bit from what has been done on pediatrics, that websites are a very also easy to exchange information. And I would really recommend you to look at the websites from the EMA, the EU, the EUPFI, and WHO, and see that you realize what everybody is doing. And as a final one, I would say, and this is really a difficult one, but what is true for pediatrics is also true for geriatrics. At the end, everybody needs to respect good regulatory practice, but at the same time assure a balanced approach between new and existing medicines, because the patients does not matter so much when he goes to the pharmacy what the licensing date for a medicine was. Thank you very much.
So first we can take questions for Diana van Riet. Any questions on the, yes, please?
Yes, Frederic Lusala from Voisin Consulting. You mentioned the legal basis at the end of your presentation. I have two questions which are probably not answered yet, but I'd like to have your views on these questions. Number one, let's imagine that a company has a drug that is used in the geriatric population, and that to improve adherence, for instance, you only have to change the packaging to make it more readable or easier to manipulate. How do you obtain approval for that? If the drug is already on the market, it's not a line extension. It's not a new dosage form. It's just changing the packaging.
Yeah, but if you want to change the packaging, you have to submit a type 2 variation for the CMC Module 3 dossier, saying what you change and for what reasons. So you can change the packaging. What is related to that is then, if you have changed the packaging, how you can make the link that change relates to specific use of the geriatrics, and how you can reflect that in the SPC. And that is something that has not been discussed yet, and I feel uncomfortable to provide you with an answer with. But it's a good issue.
And the second question was regarding especially the eligibility for the centralized procedure. It's still a question on the legal basis. In the optional scope of the centralized procedure, there's a possibility to obtain eligibility for a drug that would represent a significant benefit for the population, the community. So if a company comes to EMA and asks for eligibility for a drug that is not a new active substance, that it is not in the short list of indications that usually have access to the centralized procedure. Would they be able to access the centralized procedure with a product that is intended to be used in the geriatric population?
That's a good question, but that's also a very legal question. And as a pharmaceutical assessor, I don't think I'm the correct person to address that issue. What is important, though, that I think that if you have an existing product and you change that product and you make it suitable for a specific age group, you've got something to discuss with the regulators, how you can reflect that in the SPC.
So any additional? Yes, please.
Diana, Ronald Govey from Pfizer. Very useful presentation, and I think you did really well to struggle through the IT kind of challenges that you had. I have one question, I think, and it's thinking about this balance between reflection paper and guidance. You sit with the QWP. I wonder what stage the QWP think we're at now with geriatric medicine, and how are you thinking about moving towards reflection papers at this point in time?
This is an issue we have not yet discussed within the quality working party, so I'm really unable to provide you with an answer. But for sure, I think it's one of the things we will discuss as a result of this workshop when we meet again next May.
We can broaden the, yes, please. We can broaden the discussion as well. If you have other questions on the previous speakers, I will ask the previous speakers to address them.
Yeah, I have an experience from the PDCO as patient representative. I'm getting older, so I think maybe it's time now to move forward. My question is, maybe it's time to have a geriatric investigation plan and to think about a real development framework for medicine in geriatry. It's not a question of formulations. I want to be sure that crushing, splitting, you guarantee me that it's safe also and it's active. There's a lack of data on that. And maybe we could develop medicine in specific conditions for elderly patients. And also to decide together that it's not essential in some condition for elderly patients. The challenge is very important. So my question is, yes or no, it's time now before the lunch for a real geriatric investigation plan.
Certainly a thought-provoking question. I don't think we are going to answer that today, but something that we probably need to think about. Yes, please.
Alexis, just to maybe add to that, the question kind of almost assumes that you can't achieve a quality of medicine for the patient without that. I'm sure that that's not the case, really, and I'm sure that Diana, as a chemistry assessor, would believe that quality standards are in place that can guarantee safety and efficacy. So I think we need to look very carefully at why we think particular regulatory action is warranted. I felt that the discussion yesterday at the round table was very pragmatic, and Thomas Solomson was talking about doing the optimal with the regulatory mechanisms we have now. My belief is that that's the right next step.
I was wondering whether Thomas wanted to comment or.
No, I think we can come back to that at the time of the conclusion, but. My initial thoughts would be that, as we pointed out, geriatric medicines is often the key population we're focusing on, and so it would seem a bit absurd if we end up with a geriatric investigational plan. This is actually the target population for many medicines, so it is something we can come back to, but I think we can work with what we have for the time being to be successful. But let's come back to that at the conclusions.
I think we need to starting closing the session to move on for lunch. I mean, just to bring out a few elements which were addressed during the session. I mean, clearly the fact that the industry would tailor the formulation, tailor the packaging and package leaflet and pack sizes is not the entire, it will not be the end of the story. There's an aspect of prescription practices, prescription errors, the medical use, behaviors of patients and prescribers. And so there are efforts to be made on both ends. And we ask who are going to put this effort into the subject. And there's certainly a role for the industry and the regulators, a role for the healthcare professionals, but the patient is very important in that equation, and there's a need to empower the patient to adhere to the medication. So I hope I'm bringing out maybe the key messages of this session, and we will bring more towards the end of the day to summarize what we have heard today.